Hey guys, tonight we're tiptoeing through the marble halls of ancient Rome's most infamous palace, where the scent of frankincense can't quite mask the underlying rot of absolute power. You're about to witness a love story so twisted, it makes modern reality TV look like wholesome family programming. Picture this, an emperor so devastated by his wife's death that he decides to, well, let's just say his solution involves surgical knives and a pretty boy who had the misfortune of looking too much like the deceased. You probably won't make it through this tale without questioning everything you thought you knew about grief, love, and the terrifying creativity of unchecked imperial power. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing whether you're procrastinating at 2 p.m. in Tokyo or actually trying to sleep at midnight in Toronto. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 66 CE, and you're walking through the Domus Aurea, Nero's golden house, where the walls literally sparkle with gold leaf and precious gems. Your sandals whisper against floors of the rarest marble, imported from quarries in Egypt and Asia Minor. The ceiling above you rotates slowly, powered by hidden mechanisms that would make modern engineers scratch their heads. Historians still argue whether this rotating dining room actually sprinkled perfume and rose petals on guests, or if that's just ancient Roman fake news. But either way, you're moving through a space that screams, "I have too much money and not enough therapy." You pass a pool the size of a small lake. Seriously, this thing is so massive that when the palace was later demolished, they built the entire Colosseum in its footprint. That's not a metaphor. That's literally what happened. The morning light filters through panels of translucent stone, casting everything in this dreamy amber glow that makes even the enslaved attendants look like they've been Instagram filtered. And there he is, Nero himself, lounging on a couch that probably cost more than most Romans would see in a lifetime. He's not the fat, neck-bearded monster that Hollywood loves to portray. No, at 28, he's still got that artistic pretty boy thing going on, with carefully arranged golden curls and eyes that shift between dreamy poet and unhinged dictator. Faster than you can say matricide, he's strumming his lyre, because of course he is, composing what he genuinely believes will be the next great epic poem about the tragedy of Troy. But then he stops mid-strum. His attention has snagged on something, or rather someone, across the vast reception hall. You follow his gaze to see a young man, maybe 17 or 18, carrying a tray of honey cakes. The boy moves with the unconscious grace of youth, unaware that he's just become the focus of imperial attention. And that's when you see it too. The resemblance that's about to doom him. The boy has the same delicate jawline, the same way of tilting his head when he concentrates, even the same little crease between his eyebrows when he's focused on not dropping that heavy silver tray. If you squint, and Nero is definitely more than squinting, he could be Poppaea Sabina, the empress who died just months ago. The emperor's fingers tighten on his lyre, so hard you hear the wood creak. Here's a fun fact that tour guides usually skip. Nero's palace was so obscenely huge that Romans joked he was trying to turn the entire city into his personal villa. After the Great Fire of 64 CE, and no, despite the legend, Nero probably didn't fiddle while Rome burned. Fiddles hadn't been invented yet for one thing. He grabbed somewhere between 100 and 300 acres of prime Roman real estate for his pet project. That's like someone today demolishing half of Manhattan to build a personal theme park. You watch as Nero rises from his couch with the predatory focus of a cat who's just spotted movement in the grass. The courtiers around him, those professional survivors who've learned to read every micro-expression on their emperor's face, suddenly find urgent business elsewhere. The air in the room shifts, becomes charged with that particular electricity that surrounds absolute power when it's about to do something spectacularly unhinged. The boy with the honey cakes still hasn't noticed. He's made it maybe halfway across the hall, concentrating on navigating around the priceless statues and the indoor streams. Yes, Nero has actual streams running through his palace floors because why not? You want to warn him, to tell him to drop the tray and run, but of course you can't. You're just an observer in this slow-motion catastrophe, watching as Nero glides closer with the inevitability of a tsunami approaching shore. The emperor's approach is almost dance-like, which isn't surprising when you remember that Nero considers himself Rome's greatest performer. This is the man who forced audiences to sit through his multi-hour concerts, posting guards at the exits to prevent escape. Women literally gave birth during his performances because they couldn't leave. One desperate spectator faked his own death just to be carried out. And now this musical tyrant is gliding toward an unsuspecting servant boy with the kind of intensity usually reserved for religious visions. "Stop," Nero commands, and his voice carries that particular quality that makes everyone in a 50-foot radius freeze like they've been turned to stone. The boy with the honey cakes goes rigid, his knuckles white around the tray handles. A single drop of honey slides off one cake and hits the marble with a tiny splat that sounds like thunder in the sudden silence. You need to understand something about Nero to grasp the full horror of what's about to unfold. This is not your average despotic ruler content with simple executions and garden-variety tyranny. No, Nero is what happens when you give unlimited power to someone who genuinely believes he's an artistic genius trapped in a world of Philistines. He's already murdered his mother, Agrippina, had her stabbed to death after a hilariously failed attempt to drown her with a collapsing boat. The boat thing is particularly peak Nero. Overly complicated, theatrical, and ultimately botched because he trusted engineering to amateur assassins who apparently got their blueprints from a cartoon. The emperor circles the frozen boy like a sculptor examining a block of marble. You can practically see the gears turning in his head, the artistic vision taking shape. "Your name?" he asks, and his tone has shifted to something almost gentle, which is somehow more terrifying than anger would be. "Sporus, Divine One," the boy manages, his voice barely above a whisper. The name means seed in Greek, which will become gruesomely ironic in about 5 minutes of conversation. Here's where modern historians start pulling their hair out because our sources for this whole saga are, let's say, not exactly unbiased. We're relying heavily on Suetonius, who wrote his biographies about 50 years after Nero's death and had a serious axe to grind with the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Then there's Cassius Dio, writing even later, who never met a scandal he couldn't embellish. These guys are basically the ancient equivalent of tabloid journalists, if tabloid journalists had classical educations and really good Latin. Historians still argue whether half of what they wrote about Nero is character assassination, or if the emperor really was just that spectacularly unhinged. "Sporus," Nero repeats, rolling the name around in his mouth like wine. "Do you know who you resemble?" The boy shakes his head minutely, clearly hoping the correct answer is nobody important, or possibly your third cousin twice removed who lives quietly in the countryside. But Nero's already reaching out to touch the boy's face, tilting his chin up to catch the light. Several courtiers who've drifted back to watch the drama unfold actually gasp. "Poppaea," someone whispers, and immediately wishes they hadn't as Nero's head snaps around. But instead of ordering an execution, the emperor nods slowly, his eyes gaining that glassy quality of someone accessing a particularly painful memory file. Let's talk about Poppaea for a hot second, because you can't understand this twisted tale without her. Poppaea Sabina was basically the ancient Roman equivalent of that girl who makes everyone else look like they forgot to shower. Historians describe her as having amber-colored hair, which she allegedly maintained by having 500 donkeys milked daily for her beauty baths, skin like alabaster, and the kind of beauty that started wars. Well, it didn't start a war, but it did end a marriage. Nero's marriage to Octavia, who he divorced, exiled, and then had killed because apparently just breaking up wasn't dramatic enough. Nero and Poppaea's relationship was the kind of passionate disaster that would have broken ancient Twitter if it existed. She was already married when they met, to Otho, who later became emperor for about 5 minutes in the year of the 4 emperors, because Roman politics were basically a very deadly game of musical chairs. Nero solved this inconvenience by promoting Otho to governor of Lusitania, modern Portugal, which was the ancient equivalent of being sent to manage a blockbuster in Alaska. "She died carrying my child," Nero says, and his voice has gone dreamy and distant. "Some say I kicked her, but that's lies spread by my enemies. I would never. I loved her more than—" He trails off, still staring at Sporus with an intensity that makes everyone in the vicinity desperately wish they were somewhere else, like maybe Germania fighting barbarians. At least barbarians are straightforward about wanting to kill you. The truth about Poppaea's death? Historians still can't agree. The dramatic version says Nero kicked her in the stomach during an argument about him coming home late from the races. The boring version says she died from pregnancy complications, which was depressingly common in ancient Rome. The fact that Nero had her body embalmed like an Egyptian pharaoh instead of cremated Roman style suggests genuine grief, but then again, This is the same guy who used Christians as human torches for his garden parties, so normal emotional responses aren't exactly his thing. Divine Augustus, a brave courtier, ventures, using Nero's preferred title because calling him a god is apparently just part of the job now. Perhaps the boy should return to his duties? Nero doesn't even acknowledge the suggestion. He's fully locked in now, seeing not Sporus but a ghost, a possibility, a work of art waiting to be created. No, he says softly. No, I think Fortuna has delivered a gift. His smile would make sharks nervous. Tell me, Sporus, have you ever dreamed of being transformed? The word transformed hangs in the air like incense smoke, and you watch poor Sporus try to process what's happening while still balancing that tray of honey cakes. His confusion is almost painful to witness, like watching someone try to solve a calculus problem when they've only just learned addition. The other servants in the hall have achieved a level of stillness that would impress Buddhist monks, all desperately hoping that if they don't move, maybe the emperor's attention will slide past them like death passing over houses marked with lamb's blood.
I don't understand, Divine One.
Sporus manages, and his voice has that particular crack of adolescence that makes this whole scene even more uncomfortable. You're getting a better look at him now, and the resemblance to Poppaea really is uncanny. It's in the way his hair catches the light, not quite amber like hers was, but close enough that with the right treatments, and those cheekbones, high and delicate, the kind that launch 1,000 sculptures. Here's the thing about Sporus that the ancient sources conveniently gloss over. We don't actually know much about who he was before this moment. Was he a slave, a freedman, the son of some minor official who needed a job? The historians give us nothing, like he just materialized in Nero's palace one day. A blank canvas waiting for imperial madness to give him purpose. Some fringe theorists suggest he might have been deliberately placed in Nero's path by conspirators, hoping to distract the increasingly unhinged emperor. But that's giving Roman politicians way too much credit for subtlety. Nero reaches out and actually takes one of the honey cakes from the tray, biting into it thoughtfully while never breaking eye contact with Sporus. Honey drips down his fingers, and he licks it off with the casual sensuality of someone who's never been told no in his entire adult life. Tell me, he says, what do you know of metamorphosis? You can practically hear the record scratch in Sporus's brain. This is like being asked about your 5-year plan during what you thought was a routine traffic stop. The poet Ovid wrote of it, he ventures, which is actually a pretty solid answer for someone who 30 seconds ago was just trying to deliver snacks without tripping. Ovid. Nero's face lights up like a kid who's just been told Christmas is coming early. Yes, the poet understood. Forms can change, souls can migrate, beauty can be preserved. He's getting that look now, the one his courtiers recognize as Nero's about to have an idea, which historically has led to things like building a 120-foot statue of himself or deciding to dig a canal across the Isthmus of Corinth with Jewish prisoners of war. The emperor begins to circle Sporus again, but this time he's narrating like some demented nature documentary host. The jaw, see how it mirrors hers? But stronger, yes, masculine still. That can be adjusted. The eyes, not quite the right shade, but there are Egyptian cosmetics for that. The voice. He stops, frowning. The voice will need work. A fun historical fact that nobody mentions at dinner parties. Romans were actually pretty advanced when it came to gender-bending entertainment. They had entire theatrical troupes of castrati who played female roles because actual women on stage were considered about as appropriate as bringing a flamingo to a funeral. These performers were celebrities, ancient Rome's version of drag race contestants, but with more permanent commitment to the bit and significantly less fun wigs. Divine Augustus, another courtier, tries, because apparently they're taking turns being brave today. Perhaps this discussion would be better continued in private, but Nero's already in full artistic fugue state. He's seeing not what is, but what could be. You've seen this look before on every overly ambitious home renovator who's about to tear down a load-bearing wall. He's perfect, the emperor breathes. It's as if the gods themselves have sent him. Don't you see? Poppaea can return to us. Sporus drops the tray. The crash of silver on marble is spectacular. Honey cakes exploding across the floor like tiny sticky bombs. One skids all the way to where a senator is standing, splattering his toga with honey. Nobody moves to clean it up. Nobody even breathes too loud. This is like watching someone accidentally knock over the nuclear football. You just freeze and hope the explosion doesn't happen. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Sporus stammers, dropping to his knees, scrambling to collect the ruined cakes with shaking hands. Please, Divine One. I didn't mean. Leave it, Nero commands, and his voice has gone soft again, which is worse than shouting. Stand up. Let me see you properly. Sporus rises slowly, honey on his hands, terror in his eyes. In this light, with fear making his features sharp and pale, the resemblance to Poppaea becomes even more pronounced. You remember those old Hollywood stories about studios finding doubles for their biggest stars, keeping them on standby for dangerous stunts or public appearances. But this is something else entirely. This is a grief so toxic, it's about to reshape reality itself to avoid dealing with loss. Historians still argue whether Nero's plan formed instantly in this moment, or whether he'd been harboring this twisted fantasy since Poppaea's death. The timing is suspicious. It's been only a few months since she died, barely long enough for the funeral perfumes to fade. Some scholars think he'd already been searching for a suitable candidate, that Sporus's appearance in the palace was no accident. Others insist it was pure impulsive madness, a spur-of-the-moment decision that spiraled into one of history's most disturbing episodes. You will come with me, Nero decides, and it's not a request. There are preparations to make, consultations to arrange. He pauses, then adds with the casual cruelty of absolute power. Your old life is over, Sporus, but don't worry, your new one will be magnificent. As guards step forward to escort the bewildered boy away, you catch a glimpse of his face. It's the expression of someone who's just realized they're trapped in a nightmare where the monster wears a crown and writes poetry. The honey on his hands looks uncomfortably like blood in the shifting light of the palace, and you can't help but think that's probably not the last parallel to blood this story's going to draw. The guards are leading Sporus away now, and as you watch his retreating figure, honey still glistening on his trembling hands, your mind drifts backward through time's twisted corridors. To understand the magnitude of what's about to happen to this boy, you need to witness the death that started it all. The palace around you shimmers and shifts like heat mirages, and suddenly, it's a year earlier, the summer of 65 CE, and Poppaea Sabina is still magnificently, disastrously alive. You're in their private quarters now, where the walls are painted with scenes of Venus emerging from sea foam. Poppaea's favorite goddess, naturally. She's reclining on a couch that probably cost more than a legion's annual salary. Her famous amber hair spread across silk cushions, imported from lands so distant that Roman mapmakers just wrote, "Here be dragons," and called it a day. At nearly 9 months pregnant, she's swollen with what Nero desperately hopes will be his heir. Though Roman gynecology being what it is, they're basically just burning incense and hoping for the best. You're late, she says without looking up from the scroll she's reading. Even heavily pregnant and presumably uncomfortable, she manages to make those two words sound like a dagger wrapped in honey. This is a woman who once convinced Nero to execute his own mother, though to be fair, Agrippina was already on his hit list for the crime of existing, while knowing embarrassing stories about his childhood. Nero stumbles in, reeking of wine and the circus, that particular combination of sweat, horses, and sand that tells you he's been at the races again. His toga is askew, his golden curls wilted, and he's got that defensive drunk energy of someone who knows they're in trouble but is too intoxicated to care properly. The races ran long, he slurs, which is ancient Rome's equivalent of sorry babe, traffic was terrible. Here's the thing about Roman chariot racing that Hollywood always gets wrong. It wasn't just entertainment. It was basically ancient NASCAR mixed with gang warfare. The racing factions, the blues, greens, reds, and whites, were like political parties, sports teams, and organized crime families rolled into one. Nero, because he couldn't do anything halfway, didn't just watch the races. He competed in them, which scandalized the Senate about as much as if a modern president decided to join WWE and start body slamming foreign diplomats. The races, Poppaea repeats, setting down her scroll with the kind of deliberate precision that makes grown men flinch. While I sit here, growing your child like some common broodmare, you're playing charioteer with freedmen and slaves. The temperature in the room drops about 20 degrees. You can actually see Nero's alcohol-fuzzy brain trying to calculate whether he's in grovel and apologize territory, or if he can bluff his way through this. He chooses, with the wisdom of the deeply drunk, to go on the offensive. "I am the emperor," he roars. "And wow, that's the wrong move. I am a god. If I choose to race, if I choose to display my divine skill before my people." "Your divine skill?" Papia's laugh could strip paint. "You fell out of your chariot, twice, my hairdresser told me. The whole circus saw their god faceplant in horse dung. And this is where our historical sources start disagreeing, like relatives at Thanksgiving dinner. Suetonius says what happens next is deliberate, that Nero, in a rage, kicks Poppaea in her pregnant belly. Tacitus is more circumspect, suggesting it might have been an accident during a regular domestic squabble. Cassius Dio goes full soap opera and claims Nero jumped on her stomach, which seems physically improbable given Roman furniture heights. But hey, he wasn't there either. What happens in this room? In this moment, you're witnessing through time's warped lens. Depends on which historian you trust. The dramatic version has Nero crossing the room in 3 strides, his face purple with wounded pride and cheap wine. The mundane version has him stumbling, trying to gesture dramatically, and catching her with his foot as he loses his balance. Either way, his foot connects with her swollen abdomen. The sound Poppaea makes isn't a scream. It's smaller than that, more surprised. A soft "oh," like she's just remembered something she forgot to do. She doubles over, hands clutching her belly, and suddenly there's blood. So much blood. Roman medicine knows exactly nothing about emergency obstetrics, but even you, with your modern knowledge carried uselessly across the centuries, can see this is catastrophically bad. Nero's rage evaporates instantly, replaced by the kind of clarity that only comes with the realization that you've just done something irreversibly stupid. He's on his knees beside her couch, hands hovering over her like he's afraid to touch her, like she might shatter. "My love? My goddess?" She's trying to speak, but the pain has stolen her words. The household slaves are flooding in now, drawn by that ancient servant spider sense that tells them when the masters have gone from regular fighting to someone might die fighting. Someone's shouting for the physician, but Roman doctors are basically enthusiastic amateurs with sharp tools and a working knowledge of which prayers to say while their patients die anyway. Fun historical tidbit that nobody tells you. Poppaea might have actually had a shot at survival if this had happened literally anywhere else in the Mediterranean. The Egyptians had developed surprisingly advanced obstetric techniques, including cesarean sections where the mother occasionally survived. But Rome, for all its aqueducts and legal systems, was still at the let's try bloodletting and see what happens stage of medical science. You watch the physician arrive, take one look at the amount of blood, and immediately start preparing the "sorry for your loss" speech. Nero's cradling Poppaea's head in his lap now, stroking her famous amber hair, whispering promises to every god in the pantheon if they'll just save her. She's conscious enough to look at him, and her expression is complicated. Pain, yes, but also something else. Vindication? Disappointment? The face of someone who gambled on taming a monster and lost? "The baby," she whispers, and then she's gone. Just like that. No dramatic last words. No operatic death scene. One moment, she's Poppaea Sabina, the woman who could make an emperor crawl, and the next, she's cooling meat on a bloody couch. Historians still argue whether the baby was born dead or died shortly after. The sources are deliberately vague, probably because even ancient Roman writers felt weird about going into detail about dead imperial babies. What we do know is that Nero lost both his wife and his potential heir in the span of about an hour, all because he couldn't handle being teased about falling off a chariot. The emperor's grief is immediate and theatrical, which is very on brand. He's wailing, tearing his clothes, demanding the impossible from doctors who are professionally trained to nod sympathetically while backing slowly toward the door. When he finally accepts that she's truly dead, his first decree is that she won't be cremated like a proper Roman matron. No, she'll be embalmed like an Egyptian queen, pumped full of preserving spices that cost more than most Romans see in a lifetime. She will be divine, he declares through his tears. The goddess Poppaea Sabina. Temples will rise in her honor. Priestesses will tend her flame. He's already rewriting reality, transforming his victim into his deity. Because acknowledging what actually happened would mean admitting he's not a god, but just a man with a temper problem and terrible aim. The palace transforms into a monument to denial over the following weeks, and you're here to witness every unhinged moment of it. Nero orders every surface that Poppaea ever touched to be covered in gold leaf, like he's trying to preserve her fingerprints in precious metal. The room where she died becomes a shrine that nobody's allowed to enter except him, and you can hear him in there at night, having full conversations with the blood-stained couch where she breathed her last. The servants pretend not to notice when he emerges at dawn, his face streaked with tears and kohl, clutching strands of amber hair that he's been collecting from her brushes like the world's most disturbing scrapbook. The embalming process alone is a masterclass in imperial excess. They bring in Egyptian specialists who normally work on Ptolemaic royalty, guys who learned their trade from priests, who learn from priests who claim their techniques go back to the ones who preserved Cleopatra. The amount of myrrh and cinnamon they pump into Poppaea's corpse could supply Rome's spice market for a decade. Nero supervises every step, correcting the professionals like he's suddenly an expert on mummification, because he once read a Greek translation of the Book of the Dead while high on Spanish wine. More cinnamon around the eyes, he insists, leaning over the table where his wife's body lies naked and increasingly waxy. She loved how it made them sparkle. The Egyptian embalmers exchange glances that clearly say, "This isn't how any of this works." But they're not about to correct an emperor who's obviously one bad day away from feeding someone to lions, or worse, making them sit through another of his musical performances. Here's a detail that really drives home how far gone Nero is. He starts issuing coins with Poppaea's image labeled Diva Poppaea Augusta, literally, Divine Empress Poppaea. This is huge. Romans didn't just casually deify people, especially women. Even Augustus, the first emperor, had to wait until he was safely dead to get the god treatment. But Nero's out here minting currency with his wife's face surrounded by stars like she's some kind of cosmic entity who definitely didn't die because he lost his temper about sports. The funeral, when it finally happens, makes royal weddings look understated. The entire Roman Forum is carpeted with rose petals, not scattered, carpeted. You're wading through flowers like snowdrifts, and the smell is so intense that senators are discreetly puking into their togas. Nero delivers a eulogy that goes on for 3 hours, during which he claims Poppaea appeared to him in a dream and forgave him, which absolutely nobody asked about, but now everyone has to pretend they believe, because contradicting the emperor's ghost stories is a great way to become one yourself. "She spoke to me," he tells the assembled crowd, tears streaming down his face in perfectly parallel lines, because even his grief has to be aesthetically pleasing. "She said she waits for me in the realm of Venus, preparing a palace for when we're reunited." Someone in the crowd definitely mutters, "Hopefully soon," but they're smart enough to do it very quietly. But here's where Nero's mourning takes a turn from excessive but understandable to "someone please check the lead content in his wine." He starts demanding that everyone in Rome observe mourning rituals for Poppaea, not just the nobility, everyone. Bakers have to wear dark togas while kneading dough. Prostitutes are fined for wearing bright colors. He stations guards at the city gates to confiscate any flowers that aren't white, because colored blooms are too joyful for a city in mourning. The latest in Nero's grief innovations: Poppaea impersonators. He hires women, and it has to be women with exactly the right shade of amber hair, to walk through the palace, wearing her clothes, her jewelry, even her signature perfume. They're instructed to move like her, laugh like her, use her favorite phrases. One poor girl gets executed because she accidentally used Poppaea's childhood nickname for her cat, which Nero hadn't told her about, proving she wasn't channeling the Empress's spirit properly. The other impersonators quickly learned to be vaguer in their performances. Historians still argue whether this was genuine grief or performative madness. The boring academic answer is probably both. Nero was that special kind of person who could experience real emotions while simultaneously turning them into theater. His pain was genuine, but so was his narcissism, creating this toxic cocktail, where mourning Poppaea became just another stage for him to perform on. Some scholars suggest he was less grieving his wife than the loss of his favorite audience member, the one person who could match his drama with her own. You watch him commission statue after statue of Poppaea, each one slightly off. "The nose is wrong," he screams at one sculptor. She would never tilt her head at that angle. The artist, who never met Poppaea alive and is working from coins and death masks, just nods and starts over. By the fifth revision, the statues don't look like Poppaea anymore. They look like Nero's idealized memory of her, which is somehow both more and less than she ever was. The really messed up part is that Rome is kind of into it. Not the mourning regulations. Everyone hates those. But the theatrical grief itself. Romans love a good show, and Nero's giving them tragedy on an epic scale. Street performers start doing Poppaea's ghost routines. Poets compose increasingly elaborate verses about love beyond death. There's even a hot new religious cult forming around Diva Poppaea, though it's unclear whether the worshippers actually believe she's divine, or just think joining might get them imperial favor. But then comes the night when everything shifts. You're in the palace gardens where Nero's had about 200 white doves released because Poppaea once mentioned she thought they were pretty. The birds are crapping on everything, but pointing this out would be suicide. Nero's standing in the middle of this avian chaos, looking up at the moon, when he says something that makes every courtier in earshot suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. She's not really gone, he announces to the moon, the doves, and anyone too slow to escape. The gods wouldn't be so cruel. They've hidden her somewhere, transformed her perhaps, like in the old stories. All I have to do is find her again. A normal person might mean this metaphorically. They might be talking about finding traces of their loved one in memories, in dreams, in the faces of strangers. But this is Nero, and when he says find her again, you can see the wheels turning towards something much more literal and infinitely more disturbing. The doves circle overhead, their white wings catching moonlight, and for just a moment they look like ghosts themselves, harbingers of the horror that's about to unfold. The moonlit garden fades as time lurches forward again, and you're back in the palace 3 days after Nero's encounter with Sporus. The honey has been cleaned up, but the boy's fate is already sealed, wrapped in the emperor's grief-drunk delusions, tighter than any Egyptian mummy. You find yourself in a room that definitely wasn't on the public tour. Nero's private study, where the scrolls contain everything from bad poetry to execution lists, sometimes on the same papyrus, because multitasking is timeless. Sporus is here, looking like he hasn't slept since the honeycake incident. He's wearing new clothes now, expensive ones, that fit him too well to be coincidence. Someone's been taking measurements. His hair has been washed with something that brings out golden highlights he probably didn't know he had. And there's a subtle tremor in his hands that suggests he's beginning to understand he's not here for a normal job interview. Nero's pacing the room like a caged leopard, dictating to a secretary who's writing so fast his stylus is practically smoking. "Send for Lucius of Alexandria," he commands. "Tell him price is no object. Also that Greek physician, the one who studied in Babylon. What's his name? The one who fixed Senator Corvus after that unfortunate incident with the elephant." The secretary murmurs something about Demetrios, still scribbling. "Yes, him. And find me every text on divine transformation. Start with Ovid, obviously, but also check the Egyptian sources. There must be precedents. The gods change forms all the time." He spins around, fixing Sporus with that intense stare that makes you want to check if your internal organs are still in the right place. They'll see. This isn't madness, it's mythology made real. Here's your disturbing historical fun fact. Castration was actually a weirdly common practice in the ancient world, not just in Rome but across multiple civilizations. The Persians had been doing it for centuries to create trustworthy harem guards. The Assyrians used it as a form of punishment that was considered more humane than death, which tells you everything about Assyrian values. Even in Rome, despite official laws against castrating Roman citizens, there was a thriving black market in eunuchs imported from outside the empire. Supply and demand, baby. And rich Romans demanded servants who couldn't impregnate their wives or daughters. "Divine Augustus," Sporus finally manages to speak, and his voice cracks on every syllable. "I don't understand what you want from me." Nero stops pacing so abruptly that his toga swirls around him like a dramatic cape, which was probably intentional. Everything Nero does has an element of performance. "What I want," he laughs, but it's not a happy sound. "I want the impossible. I want to reach into Hades itself and drag my beloved back to the light. But since the gods deny me that, I'll settle for their next best gift." He produces a piece of parchment that he's clearly been working on, covered in sketches and notes in his own hand. You get a glimpse and immediately wish you hadn't. It's like seeing the planning documents for someone's descent into madness, complete with diagrams. There are drawings of faces, Papaya's from memory, Sporus's from life, and a third that's somehow both and neither, labeled the divine synthesis. You see, Nero explains with the enthusiasm of someone sharing their favorite conspiracy theory. The soul is housed in the body, but bodies can be adjusted, reshaped. The Egyptians knew this. Why else would they preserve corpses so carefully? They understood that form and essence can be separated and recombined. The secretary has stopped writing, his stylus hovering over the wax tablet like he's not sure he wants to record this for posterity. Smart man. Sometimes being a witness to history is like being the only sober person at a party where someone's about to suggest playing with fireworks indoors. But I'm not. Sporus starts, then stops, probably realizing that explaining to a delusional emperor that you're not actually his dead wife's reincarnation is like explaining to a tornado that you'd rather it didn't hit your house. The tornado's going to do what it wants regardless. Nero waves away his protests like they're annoying flies. The surgeons tell me it's quite simple. Really. A few cuts. Some careful healing. The right hormonal adjustments. Did you know certain herbs can actually change how the body develops? Fascinating stuff. The Scythians have been using them for generations on their shamans. And then there's the training, of course. Voice lessons, movement coaching, the proper mindset cultivation. Historians still argue whether Nero understood the full implications of what he was proposing, or if he was so deep in his fantasy that he genuinely believed he could recreate Poppaea through crude surgery and acting lessons. The optimistic interpretation is that he was having a complete psychotic break. The pessimistic one is that he knew exactly what he was doing and just didn't care about the human cost. The realistic interpretation is probably somewhere in the middle. A man whose grief had curdled into something monstrous, enabled by absolute power and surrounded by people too terrified to suggest therapy. I've consulted the auguries, Nero continues. Really building steam now. The signs are clear. The gods sent you to me for this purpose. Your appearance at the exact moment when my grief was strongest? That's not coincidence. That's divine intervention. You want to point out that correlation doesn't imply causation. But you're also just a time-traveling observer, so you bite your metaphysical tongue. Besides, trying to explain logical fallacies to Nero would be like trying to teach a shark about vegetarianism. Technically possible, but likely to end with someone getting bitten. Sporus looks around the room desperately, maybe hoping for a deus ex machina to save him. But this isn't a play, despite Nero treating it like one. This is real life in ancient Rome, where the emperor's word is law, and the law is having a nervous breakdown. What if I refuse? He whispers. The temperature in the room drops so fast, you'd think someone opened a portal to Germanic winter. Nero doesn't shout. He doesn't threaten. He just looks at Sporus with the kind of calm that precedes natural disasters. Refuse. Did Daphne refuse Apollo? Did Io refuse Zeus? The gods don't ask permission when they choose to transform mortals. They simply transform. And there it is. The moment when divine delusion crystallizes into surgical intent. You can actually see it happen in Nero's eyes. The shift from "wouldn't it be nice if" to "this is definitely happening." It's like watching someone decide to get a face tattoo at 3 a.m., except infinitely worse and involving literal castration. 3 weeks later, you're standing in a room that smells like a combination of incense, opium smoke, and the kind of fear that leaves a metallic taste in the air. The surgical chamber has been prepared with the kind of attention to detail usually reserved for religious ceremonies, which in Nero's mind, this basically is. Bronze instruments gleam on a side table, arranged with disturbing precision. Clamps, scalpels, cauterizing irons that are heating over braziers, like the world's worst barbecue setup. Sporus is laid out on a marble slab that's been thoughtfully padded with silk cushions, because apparently Nero believes in comfortable mutilation. The boy's been dosed with enough poppy seed wine to knock out a small elephant, but his eyes are still tracking movement with the desperate awareness of prey that knows the predator is closing in. They've shaved him completely, and I mean completely, which in this lighting makes him look even younger and more vulnerable than his probable 18 years. The medical team Nero's assembled looks like the ancient world's most reluctant Avengers. There's Lucius of Alexandria, who supposedly learned his trade, castrating future priests of Cybele, and looks like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. Next to him stands Demetrios the Greek, clutching a leather satchel full of mysterious powders and muttering what sound like either prayers or curse words in 3 different languages. Rounding out this cheerful bunch is a Cappadocian specialist whose name nobody can pronounce, brought in specifically because he claims to have a technique that reduces bleeding by 40%, which is the kind of specific statistic that's either reassuring or completely made up. The stars are properly aligned, Nero announces from his position at the head of the table, because of course he's going to watch. He's wearing white robes like he's the high priest of this nightmare, and he's got Poppeia's favorite necklace wrapped around his wrist like some kind of deeply disturbing charm bracelet. Venus rises in the house of transformation. The omens are perfect. Fun historical sidebar that'll make you grateful for modern medicine. Ancient Roman surgery was basically educated guesswork with sharp objects. They had no concept of germs, no real anesthesia beyond drink this and hope for the best, and their idea of antiseptic was wine, which at least gave patients something to look forward to. The survival rate for major surgery was essentially a coin flip, and that's when they were just removing arrows or kidney stones. What they're about to do to Sporus is considerably more complicated. Perhaps we should review the procedure once more, Demetrios suggests, clearly stalling. You can see him eyeing the door like he's calculating whether he can make it before the guards catch him. Lucia sighs with the weight of a man who's made all the wrong career choices. The primary incision will be here, he indicates on a truly uncomfortable anatomical diagram. We'll need to work quickly once we begin. The blood loss, he trails off, probably remembering that scaring the emperor might result in his own impromptu surgery. Here's the grotesque reality of ancient castration that your high school history teacher definitely skipped. There were actually several different methods, each more nightmarish than the last. The simple method just removed the testicles, which was bad enough, but at least left some functionality intact. The complete method, which is what Nero's demanding, removed everything, essentially creating what medicine would later term a urethral opening. The procedure had maybe a 50% survival rate on a good day, and infection killed most of the ones who made it through the surgery itself. I've prepared the herbal mixture, the Cappadocian adds, producing a bowl of something that looks like green sludge and smells like a compost heap's fever dream. Applied immediately after the cutting, it should reduce putrefaction. The way he says should makes everyone in the room clench simultaneously. Sporus makes a sound through his drug haze, not quite a word, more like the ghost of a protest. Nero immediately moves to stroke his hair, and the contrast between the tender gesture and what's about to happen makes your skin crawl. Shh, my darling, soon you'll be free of this crude form, soon you'll be perfect. The really messed up part? This isn't even the first time Nero's ordered something like this. Historians mention at least 2 other eunuchs in his household, though whether they were voluntary converts, and how voluntary can it be when the emperor suggests it, or imports from the eastern slave markets is unclear. What makes Sporus special is the intentionality. This isn't just creating a eunuch for practical purposes. This is trying to sculpt a dead woman out of a living boy. Begin, Nero commands, and the medical team exchanges looks that clearly say, remember when we thought studying medicine would be a respectable career? Lucius takes up the first instrument, a bronze clamp that looks like something you'd use to torture confessions out of particularly stubborn lobsters. Hold him, he instructs the assistants, though between the drugs and the leather restraints, Sporus isn't going anywhere. It's more ritual than necessity at this point, everyone playing their assigned roles in Nero's macabre theater. The actual procedure, when it begins, is mercifully hidden from your view by the crowd of medical professionals, but you can hear it, the wet sounds that definitely aren't supposed to come from human bodies, the hiss of hot metal meeting flesh, the sharp intake of breath from one of the younger assistants, who's probably reconsidering his career choices. Nero watches it all with the intensity of someone attending a religious miracle, occasionally murmuring what sound like notes for a poem he's composing about the experience, because of course he's going to turn this into art. Historians still argue about the exact techniques used, mainly because nobody who wrote about it wanted to go into graphic detail. We know they had to work fast. Blood loss was the primary killer. We know they used a combination of cutting and cauterization, basically burning the wounds closed as they went. We know they packed the whole area with wine-soaked bandages, and probably every antibacterial herb they could think of, which in ancient Rome meant throwing plant matter at the problem and hoping the gods were feeling merciful. The transformation begins, Nero whispers, and his eyes have that glassy quality of religious ecstasy. Can you feel it? The divine essence shifting, reshaping itself. What's actually happening is that Sporus's body is going into shock, but try explaining that to an emperor who thinks he's witnessing metamorphosis in real time. The boy's skin has gone the color of old parchment, and his breathing sounds like he's trying to inhale through wet cloth. The surgeons work with desperate efficiency, knowing that every second increases the chance this will go from castration to murder, and explaining to Nero why his reborn Papatea is actually just dead would be career-limiting in the extreme. Almost done, Lucius mutters, though whether he's reassuring his patient, his emperor, or himself is anyone's guess. The cauterizing iron makes another appearance, and the smell that fills the room is something you'll be glad you can't fully experience through the time stream. Let's just say it's nothing like the barbecue comparison and leave it at that. 6 months pass in a haze of healing, hormones, and what can only be described as the world's most twisted makeover montage. You watch Sporus emerge from his recovery like a butterfly from a chrysalis. If butterflies were forced into their transformations by mad emperors and the chrysalis was made of surgical bandages and poppy milk addiction, he survived. Barely. The infection that nearly killed him in week 3 left him with a fever so high that he spoke in tongues for 2 days, claiming to see Papaea's ghost giving him fashion advice, which Nero interpreted as a divine blessing rather than delirium. Now you're standing in the palace's preparation chambers on what Nero has declared the most blessed day in Roman history. Sporus sits before a mirror of polished silver, and the reflection staring back is genuinely unsettling. The herbs and treatments have worked their crude magic. His features have softened. His body has changed in ways that make the servants whisper about dark magic when they think nobody's listening. The resemblance to Papaea has gone from notable to uncanny, helped along by an army of cosmetic artists who've been working since before dawn. Hold still, commands the head stylist, a freedwoman who used to work on Papaea herself and looks like she's questioning every life choice that led her to this moment. She's applying kohl around Sporus's eyes with the precision of someone defusing a bomb, because disappointing Nero on his wedding day would be significantly worse than any explosion. The divine Augustus wants the exact shade her ladyship used to wear. The wedding dress, and yes, it's absolutely a dress, hangs nearby like a ghost made of silk and gold thread. It's one of Papaea's actual gowns, preserved with the kind of obsessive care usually reserved for religious relics. The seamstresses have had to take it in slightly because Sporus, despite everything, still has the frame of a teenage boy rather than a woman who enjoyed her honeycakes. The veil is new, though, woven with actual gold thread and pearls that probably cost more than most Romans would see in 10 lifetimes. The Senate has arrived, a herald announces, and you can hear the reluctance in his voice. Nobody wants to be here, but everyone who's anyone in Rome has to attend because snubbing the emperor's wedding is like RSVPing no to your own execution. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Roman weddings were actually complex legal affairs with multiple types of ceremonies depending on social class and desired outcomes. The type Nero's chosen, conferatio, was the most ancient and sacred form, usually reserved for patrician families and requiring the presence of the Pontifex Maximus and 10 witnesses. It was so binding that divorce was nearly impossible, which adds another layer of crazy to this whole situation, since Nero's essentially permanently marrying someone he's surgically altered to look like his dead wife. The quirky tidbit: Roman wedding ceremonies included a ritual where the bride would wear a straight-hemmed tunic tied with a Hercules knot that only the husband could untie, symbolizing, well, you can probably guess. The fact that Nero's insisting on every traditional element of a female bride's preparation for Sporus is both deeply symbolic and deeply disturbing. They even have the traditional yellow veil, flammeum, and the six-pad hairstyle, seni-crines, that virgin brides wore, though calling Sporus a virgin at this point seems like missing the forest for the extremely traumatized trees. It's time. Nero appears in the doorway, resplendent in a toga that's so white it practically glows. He's wearing a crown of laurel leaves like he's just won a military victory, instead of orchestrating history's most uncomfortable wedding. His eyes, when he sees Sporus, are genuinely terrifying. There's love there, but it's the kind of love that serial killers feel for their victims' skin suits. The walk to the ceremony feels like a funeral procession. If funerals came with rose petals and lyre music, the entire palace has been decorated with flowers and tapestries depicting famous mythological transformations. Daphne becoming a tree, Io becoming a cow, Arachne becoming a spider. Subtle, Nero. Real subtle. The guests line the corridors, their faces frozen in expressions that could generously be called polite interest, but more accurately resemble people watching a carriage accident in slow motion. You enter the main hall where the ceremony will take place, and it's genuinely spectacular in that way that makes you forget. for just a moment, how fundamentally wrong this all is. The ceiling has been painted with new frescoes showing Nero and Poppaea in various divine poses, except now, half of them have been modified to show Sporus's face instead. The altars to Juno and Jupiter smoke with enough incense to hotbox the entire Roman Forum. Historians still argue whether this ceremony was legally binding or just elaborate theater. The conservative view is that Roman law wouldn't have recognized a marriage between two people born male, regardless of surgical intervention. The more radical interpretation suggests that Nero's absolute power meant he could redefine legal reality at will. If the emperor says his castrated boy bride is legally a woman and his wife, who's going to argue? The Senate? They're all here wearing their best togas and pretending this is normal. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest priest, looks like he'd rather be performing funeral rites. His hands shake as he holds the ceremonial cake of spelt that's central to the Conferri Trimonio ceremony. You can practically see him mentally composing his resignation letter, though he knows perfectly well that you don't resign from Nero's Rome. You either serve or you mysteriously develop a fatal case of sword-through-stomach syndrome. Let all who witness know, Nero proclaims, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who's completely bought into their own delusion that the gods have blessed us with a miracle. Love conquers even death itself. Sporus stands perfectly still throughout, his face hidden behind the golden veil. You can't see his expression, but his hands are clenched so tight in the folds of Poppaea's dress that his knuckles are white. The wedding torches flicker, casting shadows that make everyone look like players in some underworld drama, which isn't far from the truth. The actual ceremony proceeds with excruciating attention to tradition. They exchange vows. Nero's passionate and theatrical. Sporus is barely audible. They share the ritual cake, though Sporus seems to have trouble swallowing. The matron of honor, a senator's wife who looks like she's been heavily bribed or threatened, performs the joining of hands, wrapping them in wool that's been dyed the traditional saffron yellow. I take you as my wife, Nero declares, restored to me by divine will, my Poppaea reborn, my goddess made flesh again. The use of Poppaea's name makes several guests visibly flinch. Even in ancient Rome, where they were pretty casual about things like slavery and blood sports, this is pushing the boundaries of acceptable weirdness. When Nero lifts the veil for the traditional kiss, there's a collective intake of breath from the assembled crowd. In this light, with the cosmetics and the dress and the context forcing everyone to see what Nero wants them to see, Sporus really does look disturbingly like the dead empress. It's like watching someone kiss a ghost, if ghosts were made of traumatized teenagers and surgical scars. The kiss lasts exactly as long as you'd expect from Nero, which is to say, uncomfortably long and unnecessarily dramatic. Someone in the crowd actually applauds, probably out of nervous reflex, and then stops abruptly when they realize they're the only one. The silence that follows is the kind that makes you very aware of your own heartbeat. The wedding feast that follows makes you grateful you're just a temporal observer, and not an actual guest, forced to choke down peacock tongues while pretending this is all perfectly normal. Sporus, or rather Empress Poppaea, as the herald announces him, sits at Nero's right hand, picking at delicacies that probably taste like ash in his mouth. The new wedding ring on his finger is actually Poppaea's original, resized to fit, because apparently grave robbery is just another Tuesday in Nero's Rome. You watch Sporus navigate his first official dinner as Empress, with the kind of careful precision usually reserved for walking through a minefield. Every gesture has been coached, every tilt of his head rehearsed until muscle memory takes over where sanity fled. He holds his wine cup exactly the way Poppaea used to. Pinky slightly extended, wrist turned just so. The servant refilling it is one who served the real Poppaea, and you catch the moment when their eyes meet. The slave's face goes through about 17 different emotions in 2 seconds before settling on, I see nothing, I know nothing, I am furniture with hands. My dove, Nero coos, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. You must try the roasted flamingo. It was your favorite. The use of past tense and present tense in the same breath makes everyone's brain hurt. But that's life in Nero's reality distortion field. Sporus takes a delicate bite of the flamingo, which is about as appetizing as it sounds. Fun fact about Roman cuisine: they genuinely believed the more exotic and difficult to obtain your dinner was, the more sophisticated you were. This led to dishes like giraffe marrow, parrot brains, and yes, flamingo, which apparently tastes like fishy chicken with a side of existential dread. The poor birds were imported from Africa at enormous expense, just so rich Romans could prove they had more money than sense. Delicious, Sporus murmurs, in that carefully modulated voice he's been trained to use. Higher than his natural register, but not quite falsetto. Hitting that uncanny valley between masculine and feminine that makes everyone deeply uncomfortable. The voice coaches have been working overtime, using techniques borrowed from actors who specialized in female roles. They make him gargle with honey and vinegar every morning, which sounds like a folk remedy, but was actually based on the theory that it would soften the vocal cords. Spoiler alert, it mostly just made him smell like a salad dressing. The days that follow establish a routine that would be hilarious if it weren't so deeply disturbing. Every morning, Sporus is awakened at dawn by the same servants who used to attend Poppaea. They dress him in her clothes, and we're talking about a woman who had 300 dresses, each more elaborate than the last. The famous cloth of gold dress alone requires 3 people to put on properly, with its complex system of pins, clasps, and structural undergarments that are basically architectural engineering in fabric form. Arms up, Domina, the headdresser says, using the feminine form of a dress with only the slightest hesitation. She's been doing this for 3 weeks now, and the cognitive dissonance is starting to show. You can see it in the way her hands shake slightly as she adjusts the breast padding, cunning constructions of wool and linen, designed to create the illusion of feminine curves where none exist. The technology is surprisingly sophisticated. Historians still argue whether these early forms of prosthetic breasts were a Roman invention or borrowed from Eastern traditions where eunuchs had been navigating gender presentation for centuries. The jewelry comes next, and Nero has insisted that Sporus wear different pieces each day, rotating through Poppaea's extensive collection like the world's most macabre fashion show. Today it's the famous pearl necklace, the one Pliny claims was worth 6 million sesterces, which in modern money would be like wearing a medium-sized country's GDP around your neck. Sporus fingers the pearls with an expression that suggests he's calculating whether they're heavy enough to strangle himself with. Your quirky historical tidbit for today. Romans were absolutely obsessed with pearls, to the point where Julius Caesar once passed a law reserving them only for the aristocracy. Poppaea reportedly had slippers made with pearl soles, which is the ancient equivalent of those modern shoes with diamonds on the bottom. Pointless, expensive, and guaranteed to be ruined the first time you actually walk in them. Now these same pearl slippers are on Sporus's feet, which are thankfully close enough to Poppaea's size that minimal padding is required. Small mercies in this carnival of horrors. The daily schedule is a masterclass in performance art. First comes the morning salutation, where senators and important clients come to pay their respects to the emperor and empress. You watch these powerful men, generals who've conquered provinces, politicians who've outmaneuvered dozens of rivals, bow to Sporus and address him as Augusta with straight faces. One elderly senator actually kisses Sporus's hand and compliments her on her radiant beauty, and you can't tell if he's playing along out of fear or if he's gone selectively blind as a survival mechanism. The Senate appreciates your gracious presence, divine empress, the man says, and there's only the tiniest emphasis on empress to suggest he hasn't completely lost touch with reality. Sporus responds with a practiced nod and a few words about the glory of Rome, phrases he's memorized from a script Nero personally wrote. The emperor beams like a proud husband, completely missing or ignoring the fact that half his court looks like they're suppressing collective screams. Lunch is another performance, this time in the semi-public dining halls where favored courtiers are invited to dine with the imperial couple. Sporus has to recline on his couch in exactly the way Poppaea used to, left side, right arm positioned just so, the drape of the dress arranged to hide the fact that certain anatomical features are missing or artificially enhanced. He's gotten good at it, the way hostages get good at Stockholm Syndrome. Practice makes perfect, even when what you're perfecting is your own erasure. Tell them about the dream you had, my beloved. Nero prompts during one particularly excruciating lunch. This is a new level of method acting. Sporus now has to invent dreams that sound like something Poppaea would have dreamed. I saw white doves carrying golden roses, Sporus says, his voice hitting that practice register that's become second nature. They flew toward Venus's temple, singing hymns of reunion. It's exactly the kind of pseudo-mystical nonsense Nero loves. Vague enough to mean anything, romantic enough to feed his delusions. The courtiers nod along like this is profound wisdom, rather than improvised crazy talk. The afternoon brings various feminine activities that Poppaea enjoyed. Today it's overseeing the household slaves, which is deeply weird for everyone involved, since many of these slaves knew Sporus back when he was just another servant boy, trying not to drop honey cakes. Now he has to give them orders in his carefully modulated voice, while they pretend not to remember changing his bed linens 3 months ago. The atrium flowers need refreshing, Sporus instructs the head gardener, who definitely remembers when this empress was sneaking figs from the kitchen gardens. The divine Augustus prefers more roses, fewer lilies. The gardener bows and mutters something about it being done immediately, probably while internally screaming into the void. The ship lurches over another Mediterranean wave, and you're strongly reconsidering the wisdom of time traveling to Nero's Greek honeymoon tour. It's been 2 months since the wedding, and the emperor has decided that what his manufactured marriage really needs is a nice vacation to Greece, where he can show off his new wife while also competing in every artistic competition he can find. Because nothing says healthy relationship like dragging your surgically altered boy bride around the Aegean while forcing entire cities to pretend this is normal. Sporus stands at the rail, gripping it with white knuckles while trying to look elegantly seasick rather than regular person seasick. The sea breeze keeps whipping his veil around, and he's constantly having to adjust it with movements that have become disturbingly natural. The other passengers, a mix of courtiers, musicians, and various hangers-on who couldn't find good enough excuses to avoid this floating asylum, give him a wide berth. It's like watching people navigate around a beautiful but obviously cursed statue. "My dove, come away from the rail," Nero calls from his position under a purple canopy that probably cost more than the ship itself. "The spray will ruin your complexion." He's genuinely concerned about Sporus's skincare routine, which now involves milk baths, honey masks, and ground pearl powder, because apparently transforming someone into your dead wife includes giving them her exact beauty regimen. The fact that Poppaea's skincare routine survived her death in more detail than, say, her thoughts on political reform tells you everything about Roman priorities. The destination is Corinth first, then Athens, then a grand tour of every major Greek city that has a theater, stadium, or music hall. Nero's official reason is diplomatic relations. The actual reason is that he wants to compete in the Olympic Games, which aren't supposed to happen for another 2 years, but which he's forcing to occur early, because when you're emperor, you can reschedule international sporting events like dental appointments. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Nero's Greek tour of 66-67 CE was absolutely real and absolutely bonkers. He competed in the Olympics as a charioteer, falling out of his chariot but still being declared winner, entered every artistic competition he could find, winning all of them, shockingly, and generally treated Greece like his personal talent show. The Greeks, to their credit or discredit, played along beautifully, probably because Nero kept throwing money at them, and also because disagreeing with armed Romans is historically bad for your health. The ship docks at Corinth, to a welcome that would make a modern pop star jealous. The entire city has turned out, waving palm fronds and throwing flower petals, though you can see the local magistrates in the background frantically gesturing at the crowd to show more enthusiasm. A choir of children sings a hastily composed hymn to divine Nero and his restored empress, which rhymes about as well as you'd expect from something written under threat of death. "Behold," Nero announces to no one in particular, striking a pose at the top of the gangplank, "Greece shall witness love's triumph over mortality itself." Several Greek officials exchange glances that clearly say "what the fuck" in ancient Greek, but they're smart enough to keep smiling. The procession through Corinth is peak Nero. He's had a special chariot made gold-plated naturally, with seats for him and Sporus that force them to sit so close they're practically in each other's laps. Sporus maintains the rigid posture of someone who's dissociating so hard they've achieved astral projection, smiling and waving with movements so mechanical you could set your watch by them. Your quirky historical tidbit: the Greeks actually had a tradition of ceremonial gender fluidity that made them slightly less freaked out by Sporus than the Romans were. They had the galley priests of Cybele, who castrated themselves, the gender-shifting god Hermaphroditus, and various theatrical traditions where gender was more performance than biology. This didn't make Nero's situation normal, but it at least gave the Greeks a contextual framework for processing the imperial crazy. One Corinthian philosopher was overheard saying, "Well, at least he's not making his horse a consul," which shows how low the bar had gotten. The first event is a singing competition at the local Odeon. Nero insists Sporus sit in the front row, dressed in Poppaea's finest Greek-inspired gown, acting as his muse. The other competitors, actual professional musicians who've trained their whole lives, have to perform knowing they're going to lose to an emperor whose singing voice has been diplomatically described as unique and less diplomatically described as like a dying walrus attempting opera. "This song," Nero announces, "is dedicated to my beloved, proof that the gods can restore what they have taken." He launches into a ballad about Orpheus and Eurydice, completely missing the irony that in that story, the attempt to bring back the dead ends in catastrophic failure. His voice cracks on the high notes, but the audience erupts in rapturous applause that sounds only slightly forced. Sporus sits through it all, the perfect image of an adoring wife, though you notice his fingers are twisted in his lap in what might be prayer or might be an attempt to claw through his own palms. When Nero wins, because obviously Sporus has to present him with the victory crown, their fingers touching in a moment that makes the entire audience hold its breath for all the wrong reasons. The Olympics are next, and these are somehow even worse. Historians still argue about exactly how corrupted these games were by Nero's presence. The traditional view is that the Greeks, desperate for imperial favor and tourist money, would have declared Nero the winner if he'd shown up and taken a nap on the track. The revisionist view suggests that maybe Nero wasn't quite as bad at these events as Roman historians claimed, though this is somewhat undermined by the fact that he definitely fell out of his chariot and still won the race. Nero insists because the traditional Olympic chariot race uses 4 horses, but the emperor needs to be extra. My Papia deserves to see divine horsemanship. The Greek officials agree to this about as enthusiastically as people agree to dental surgery, but what are you going to do? Tell the emperor no? That's a good way to find out if crucifixion translates well to Greek. The race is a disaster. Nero can barely control 4 horses on a good day, and 10 horses have their own ideas about direction, speed, and whether they even want to participate in this farce. By the 3rd turn, he's lost the reins entirely. By the 4th, he's actively falling out of the chariot. By the 5th, he's being dragged behind it like the world's most expensive piece of luggage. Sporus watches from the imperial box, his face a mask of concern that could be real or could be performance. At this point, even he might not know the difference. When Nero is finally helped to his feet, covered in dust and missing half his laurel crown, Sporus is there with a cloth soaked in rosewater, playing the devoted wife to perfection while probably calculating how many more years of this he can survive. "Did you see, my love?" Nero gasps, somehow interpreting nearly dying as victory. "The horses recognize divine blood and refuse to truly harm me." The Olympic judges, who've been paid enough to found small cities, declare this the most magnificent chariot victory in Olympic history. One judge is crying, though whether from emotion or despair is anyone's guess. Late at night, in the Greek villa, Nero's commandeered. You slip into spaces where even time-traveling observers rarely venture. The quiet moments between performances. The private hours when Sporus can almost remember who he used to be. You find him sitting at Papia's vanity. Everything is always Papia's, never his. Staring at his reflection in the polished bronze mirror by lamplight. The face looking back is a masterwork of transformation. But behind those carefully kohled eyes, you can see the fracture lines of a psyche trying to hold itself together with theatrical makeup and practiced smiles. He's writing something on a wax tablet, then immediately smoothing it clean, then writing again. It's like watching someone have a conversation with themselves that they keep erasing out of existence. Finally, he leaves one line visible. "I dream of honey cakes and wake to pearls." The kind of poetic fragment that could mean everything or nothing, depending on how deep you're willing to dig into the metaphorical trauma. "Can't sleep, my dove?" Nero's voice from the doorway makes Sporus flinch so hard he nearly knocks over a perfume bottle worth more than a house. The emperor glides in wearing a silk sleeping robe that probably required the death of 1,000 silkworms. Looking concerned in that way that could mean genuine care or imminent violence. With Nero, it's always a coin flip weighted toward catastrophe. "Just practicing my letters, divine one," Sporus replies, and his voice in these private moments is subtly different, still pitched higher than natural, but with less performance, like an actor who's forgotten to completely leave the stage. "You said Papia's handwriting was more elegant than mine. Here's where modern psychology would have a field day. But ancient Romans had their own understanding of what we might call Stockholm Syndrome. They called it servile affection, and recognized that slaves and captives often developed genuine emotional bonds with their captors as a survival mechanism. The philosopher Epictetus, himself a former slave, wrote about how the mind adapts to chains by learning to love them, which is either profound wisdom or the ancient equivalent of trauma-induced cope posting. Nero settles behind Sporus, wrapping arms around him with the possessive tenderness of someone hugging their favorite toy. "Your letters are perfect," he murmurs into Sporus's hair, which smells of the same rose oil Papia used. "Everything about you is perfect. The gods wouldn't have sent you otherwise." You watch Sporus's face in the mirror during this embrace, and it's like watching someone solve a complex equation. How much affection should he show? Too little risks anger. Too much might seem false. He settles on leaning back slightly, just enough to seem receptive, but not enough to seem eager. It's the kind of calculation that's become second nature, survival arithmetic performed in real time. Tell me again about the dream, Nero says, and Sporus knows exactly which dream he means. The recurring one he's been trained to recite, about Poppy Spirit visiting him, blessing their union, transferring her essence into his body. It's a script they've rehearsed so many times that Sporus could probably perform it in his sleep, which is ironic, since he barely sleeps anymore. She came to me wearing starlight, Sporus begins, his voice taking on the dreamy quality Nero prefers for these recitations. She said the gods had chosen me as her vessel, that our souls were always meant to merge. The words taste like ash, but he's learned to make them sound like honey. This is survival in its most baroque form, staying alive by becoming someone else's delusion. The really messed up part? There are moments, fleeting, terrifying moments where Sporus catches himself feeling something almost like affection for Nero. Not love, never love, but something adjacent to it. The Emperor can be gentle when the mood strikes him, generous with gifts and praise. Last week, he spent 3 hours teaching Sporus to play a song on the lyre, patient as a real teacher, proud as an actual husband when Sporus finally mastered the melody. Historians still argue whether these moments of apparent tenderness make the situation better or worse. The optimistic interpretation is that Nero genuinely believed he was honoring Poppaea's memory, and that his treatment of Sporus, while insane, came from a place of twisted love. The pessimistic interpretation is that the occasional kindness was just another form of control, a way to keep his victim off balance and compliant. The realistic interpretation is that abusers don't need to be monsters 24 hours a day to still be abusers. I've been thinking, Nero says, and those 3 words from him are like hearing, I've been experimenting from someone holding a suspicious beaker. When we return to Rome, we should have a child. Sporus goes so still, he might as well be a statue. The perfume bottle he's been fidgeting with slips from nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor in an explosion of scent and broken glass. The room suddenly reeks of jasmine, Poppaea's second favorite flower, and the symbolism is thick enough to choke on. A child, Sporus manages, his voice cracking out of its careful register for just a moment before he catches himself. But Divine One, nothing is impossible for the gods, Nero says with the confidence of someone who's never met a biological fact he couldn't ignore. We'll consult the Egyptian physicians. They have ways. Or perhaps we'll adopt. Find a child who resembles us both. Yes, a little girl with amber hair. We'll name her Poppia Claudia, after the daughter we lost. Your quirky historical tidbit. Nero and the original Poppia did have a daughter who died in infancy, and Nero's grief over that loss was reportedly genuine. He had the baby deified, making her the youngest goddess in the Roman pantheon, which is either touching or deeply weird, depending on your perspective on posthumous promotions. Now he's planning to replace the replacement, creating recursive loops of substitution that would make a philosophy major's head explode. Sporus is cleaning up the broken perfume bottle, using the mundane task to avoid responding. His hands shake as he picks up the glass shards, and you notice he grips one piece a little too long, staring at its sharp edge with an expression that makes you wonder if he's calculating angles. But then Nero's hand covers his, gently taking the glass away. Careful, my love. We can't have you scarring those perfect hands. The concern sounds genuine, which somehow makes it worse. This would all be simpler if Nero were consistently monstrous. But he's not. He's a man who can order castration in the morning and spend the evening tenderly braiding his victim's hair, seeing no contradiction between cruelty and care. What am I to you? Sporus asks suddenly, the question escaping before he can stop it. It's the kind of direct query that could get him killed, but exhaustion makes people reckless. Nero looks genuinely surprised. You're my wife, my Poppy, my proof that love conquers death itself. He says it with such conviction that for a moment, you almost wonder if he's right. Maybe repeated performance can become reality. Maybe if you pretend to be someone else long enough, you actually become them. Maybe Spirus the honeycake carrier really is dead, and all that's left is this beautiful ghost wearing his mutilated body. Of course, Spirus whispers. Forgive me. Sometimes I forget myself. There's nothing to forgive. Nero kisses his forehead with disturbing tenderness. Soon you won't remember being anyone else at all. As they prepare for bed, Sporus changing into one of Poppeia's nightgowns. Nero humming a song he's composing about metamorphosis. You see Sporus catch his reflection one more time. The person in the mirror looks like Poppaea if you squint, like Sporus if you remember, like nobody if you're honest. He mouths something to his reflection, too quiet for even Nero to hear. I survive. 2 words that could be a promise, a prayer, or just a statement of fact. In this world of forced transformations and surgical identities, sometimes simple existence is the only rebellion left. The ship carrying Nero and his manufactured empress back to Rome docks at Ostia on a gray morning that matches the city's mood. Word of the emperor's Greek adventures has preceded them, carried by merchants, soldiers, and the ancient Roman equivalent of gossip bloggers, senators' wives, with too much time and too many dinner parties. You're standing at the harbor watching the crowd that's gathered, and the expressions range from morbid curiosity to barely concealed horror, like people rubbernecking at a chariot accident that's somehow still ongoing. Is that really him? A baker whispers to his neighbor, craning his neck to see Sporus descending the gangplank in full Poppaea regalia. I heard the emperor married a boy he cut up like a festival pig. Shut your mouth unless you want to join him, the neighbor hisses back. But he's looking too. Everyone's looking, because Romans love a good scandal almost as much as they love not being executed for acknowledging it. The procession back to the palace becomes an impromptu parade of cognitive dissonance. Nero's insisted on the full triumph treatment, rose petals, musicians, the works, while Sporus sits beside him waving with mechanical precision. The crowds cheer, because not cheering for the emperor is hazardous to your health, but you can hear the whispers spreading like wildfire through the Roman streets. By the time they reach the palace, 3 different versions of the story are circulating, each more embellished than the last. In the Senate House the next day, you witness the spectacular dance of politicians trying to discuss the undiscussable. Senator Gaius Maximus, a man who survived 3 emperors by having opinions as flexible as an acrobat's spine, opens the session with careful vagueness. The divine Augustus has returned from his diplomatic mission to Greece with his companion. We should discuss the triumph celebrations. Companion, Senator Lucius mutters under his breath. Is that what we're calling it? He's immediately elbowed by his neighbor, who has a better developed sense of survival. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Roman Senate by Nero's time had been reduced from a governing body to an elaborate yes-man committee. They'd learned from the examples of previous emperors that having strong opinions about imperial behavior led to strong opinions about whether you should keep your head attached to your body. This created a culture of euphemism and doublespeak that would make modern politicians look refreshingly direct. The quirky tidbit? Some senators actually saw opportunity in Nero's madness. Senator Otho, yes, the same Otho who used to be married to Poppaea before Nero stole her, reportedly joked that at least now he wouldn't have to worry about the emperor stealing any more wives. This was either remarkably good humor about losing his spouse, or evidence that Roman aristocrats had developed gallows humor as a survival mechanism. Otho would later become emperor himself for about 3 months, proving that in Rome today's cuckold could be tomorrow's Caesar. I propose we commission a statue, Senator Flavius says, because when in doubt, Romans defaulted to marble to commemorate the divine union. He manages to say it without his voice cracking, which is impressive. What would we even carve? Someone whispers. A boy in a dress? Venus with a surprise underneath? The whisperer is immediately shushed, but the question hangs in the air like incense at a funeral. Meanwhile, in the markets and taverns where regular Romans gather, the reaction is less politically filtered. You overhear a group of soldiers at a wine shop, men who fought in Germania and survived things that would make horror stories look like bedtime tales. They're still scandalized. I've seen men do things in battle that turn your hair white, one grizzled veteran says. But this is something else. The emperor's playing dress-up with a eunuch and calling it marriage. What's next? Making his horse a senator. Caligula already did that, his companion points out. Consul, a third corrects. He made his horse a consul. Which honestly seems saner than this. Historians still argue about how widespread the opposition to Nero's behavior really was. The traditional narrative paints a Rome unified in disgust, But the reality was probably more complex. For every horrified senator, there was likely a pragmatic freedman who saw opportunity in chaos. For every disgusted soldier, there might have been a progressive philosopher arguing that gender was more fluid than Roman tradition suggested. The problem is that the people who thought Nero's behavior was acceptable weren't the ones writing the histories. In the slave quarters of great houses, the reaction is different again. You listen to a group of household slaves discussing the news while preparing dinner. "Poor boy," an older woman says, shaking her head. "Sporus, wasn't it? I remember when he was just another pretty face in the palace. Now look what they've done to him." "Poor," a younger slave scoffs. "He's wearing pearls worth more than we'll see in 10 lifetimes. He eats from golden plates. Some of us would trade places in a heartbeat." "You'd trade your manhood for golden plates?" the old woman asks. The young slave hesitates, then shrugs. "I'd trade it for freedom. At least he's not scrubbing floors anymore." This perspective, practical, transactional, grimly realistic, probably represents how many lower-class Romans viewed the situation. When you're already property, the distinction between different forms of degradation becomes academic. A gilded cage is still better than a regular cage, even if the price of admission is surgical mutilation. The religious authorities are having their own crisis. The Pontifex Maximus, who performed the wedding, has been avoiding public appearances like he's developed a severe allergy to sunlight. When cornered at a sacrifice to Jupiter, he mumbles something about the divine will manifesting in mysterious ways, and practically sprints to the nearest exit. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, are reportedly split on whether Sporus should be allowed to attend women's religious festivals. It's causing the kind of theological debate that would be fascinating if it weren't so fundamentally insane. "The Empress may attend," the head Vestal declares after much deliberation, using the title like she's handling a poisonous snake. "The divine Augustus has spoken, the unspoken edition, and we don't want to end up like the previous people who disagreed with him, hangs in the air like sacrificial smoke." But it's in the brothels and theaters where you hear the most honest reactions. Prostitutes, actors, and other social outcasts have less to lose from speaking truth, even if they still do it carefully. A famous mime performer creates a wordless skit about a butterfly trying to remember it was once a caterpillar. Everyone knows what it's really about. But since there are no words, no names mentioned, he technically hasn't committed treason. The audience laughs, but it's the kind of laughter that's half sob. "At least he's original," a courtesan comments, adjusting her wig. "Most emperors just murder people. This one's getting creative with his atrocities." Back in the palace, you watch Nero and Sporus make their first public appearance since returning. The court assembles with the enthusiasm of people attending a mandatory funeral. Sporus enters wearing one of Poppaea's most iconic dresses, the one she wore to her first public appearance as empress. Several courtiers who remember that day go pale at the sight. "My beloved Romans," Nero announces, apparently oblivious to the collective discomfort radiating from his audience. "The gods have blessed our journey. In Greece, the oracles confirmed what I always knew, that love transcends death, that beauty can be preserved, that the divine will works through human hands." Sporus stands beside him, perfect as a painted statue, while the court applauds with the mechanical precision of people who've practiced not having opinions. One young courtier, new to the palace, and apparently not yet trained in survival skills, actually gasps when he gets a good look at Sporus. He's immediately hustled out by more experienced colleagues who'll explain the importance of facial control in imperial company. Furthermore, Nero continues, "Because of course there's more. I've commissioned a series of paintings depicting our divine union. They'll hang in every public building in Rome, so all citizens can witness the god's miracle." The court painter, standing near the back, looks like he's calculating whether exile in Britannia would really be that bad. He's about to become history's most reluctant propagandist, forced to create romantic portraits of a union that makes mythology's worst transformations look consensual and reasonable. As the assembly disperses, you hear fragments of whispered conversations. How long can this last? Until someone stops him. Who'd dare? Someone will. Someone always does. The seeds of future rebellion are being planted in these whispers, watered with disgust and fertilized with fear. Nero doesn't know it yet, but he's orchestrating his own ending, one grotesque performance at a time. 3 years into this manufactured marriage, the cracks are showing like fault lines before an earthquake. You're in Nero's private theater, watching him rehearse his latest artistic atrocity, a musical retelling of his own life, where he plays himself, Apollo, and somehow also Orpheus. Sporus sits in the front row, and you notice he's developed a subtle eye twitch that appears whenever Nero hits the high notes, which is often and badly. Nero shouts at the musicians, who look like they're contemplating whether deafness might be a career advantage. The crescendo must capture the moment I recognize divine beauty reborn. He gestures dramatically at Sporus, who responds with a smile that doesn't reach his eyes. Actually, it barely reaches his mouth. It's the kind of smile hostages perfect after year 3. The changes in both of them are startling when you really look. Nero's gained weight from his nightly banquets. His golden curls are thinning, and his eyes have taken on that peculiar glassy quality of someone who's been drinking their own Kool-Aid so long they've achieved a permanent buzz. He started painting his face with white lead and rouge, trying to capture the eternal youth he sees in his reflection, but everyone else recognizes as middle-aged delusion, accessorized with toxic makeup. Sporus, meanwhile, has perfected the art of being invisibly visible. He's there, but not there. Present, but absent, like a beautiful ghost haunting his own life. The hormonal treatments have continued their work. His face remains smooth, his body soft in places that make Roman anatomists write conflicting treatises. But there's something in his movements now, a careful calculation in every gesture that speaks of someone who's mapped every exit and counted every step to the nearest sharp object. "My dove, are you watching?" Nero calls out mid-warble. "This verse is about the first time I saw you." "Every note is perfection, divine one," Sporus responds automatically. But his left hand is clenched so tight in his lap that the knuckles are white. He's taken to wearing rings on every finger, gifts from Nero, and you wonder if it's vanity, or if he's calculated exactly how much force it would take to make them weapons. Here's your disturbing historical tidbit. By 67 CE, Nero's artistic pretensions had reached genuinely deranged levels. He'd instituted the Neronia, Greek-style artistic competitions that he somehow always won, despite performances that made witnesses consider voluntary exile. One competitor reportedly chose to blind himself rather than watch another of Nero's interpretive dances. The emperor took this as jealousy rather than criticism, because self-awareness was not among his many claimed talents. The really telling moment comes during dinner that evening. It's a smaller affair, only 50 guests instead of the usual 300, and Nero's in one of his philosophical moods. "Tell me, Sporus," he says, loud enough for everyone to hear, because Nero doesn't do private conversations. "Do you ever dream of your old life?" The room goes silent except for the sound of 50 people simultaneously holding their breath. It's the first time in 3 years Nero's acknowledged that Sporus had a life before becoming his recreated wife. Even the slaves serving wine freeze mid-pour. Sporus sets down his cup with careful precision. When he speaks, his voice has that practiced feminine pitch, but there's something else underneath, a vibration like a string pulled too tight. "I dream only of our divine union, my lord. My life began when you transformed me." It's the right answer, the safe answer, but Nero's eyes narrow. He's drunk enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be distracted. Surely you remember something. The taste of honey cakes, perhaps. And there it is. The first crack in Sporus's perfect mask. His eye twitches, just once. But at imperial dinner parties, people notice everything because their lives might depend on it. A senator's wife actually gasps, then covers it with a cough that fools nobody. "Honey is sweet," Sporus says slowly, "but ambrosia is sweeter. Why would I long for mortal food when I feast with gods?" Smooth recovery, but Nero's not done poking at wounds. He's been doing this more lately, testing, prodding, like a child pulling wings off flies to see if they'll still try to walk. "You know what I think?" he says, gesturing with his wine cup, so wildly that purple liquid sloshes onto priceless fabrics. "I think sometimes you forget to be grateful. I gave you immortality. I made you divine, and yet sometimes I catch you looking at me like..." He trails off, possibly realizing that finishing that sentence would mean acknowledging truths he spent 3 years denying. The silence stretches until a brave courtier starts aggressively praising the roasted peacock to change the subject. But the damage is done. Over the following weeks, you watch Nero's paranoia bloom like toxic flowers. He starts questioning servants about Sporus's activities. Did he seem sad during the morning toilet? Did he eat all his breakfast? Who did he speak to in the gardens? The questions get stranger. Did he look at any of the male slaves too long? Does he ever touch his own face when he thinks no one's watching? Has anyone heard him speak in his old voice? He's testing me, Sporus confides to his reflection one night. Not knowing you're observing from your temporal shadows. Or maybe he does know. Maybe he's so desperate for any witness that even an invisible time traveler will do. He wants me to break character so he can punish me for ruining his fantasy. The next morning brings a new horror. Nero announces he's commissioning a statue of Sporus, but not just any statue. It will show the moment of transformation, he explains to the deeply uncomfortable sculptor. Half male, half female, caught in divine metamorphosis. Future generations must understand the miracle I've created. Sporus has to pose for this abomination, standing naked while artists sketch every altered angle of his body. His face during these sessions is a masterwork of dissociation. He's perfected the art of being elsewhere, while his body remains present for cataloging. One artist quietly vomits after the session and claims it was bad fish. Nobody believes him. Historians still argue about when exactly Nero realized his delusion was failing. Some point to the statue incident, others to what happens next. Nero starts bringing in new favorites, beautiful boys who coincidentally have features that could, in certain lights, maybe resemble Poppaea. He parades them in front of Sporus like a threat. See how easily you could be replaced. See how many potential Poppaea exist in the world. Do you like him? Nero asks about his latest acquisition, a Syrian boy with amber eyes. He has something of her grace, don't you think? Sporus looks at this boy, 16 at most, terrified, probably calculating his own chances of survival. And for just a moment, his mask slips completely. The expression that flashes across his face isn't jealousy or fear. It's pity, pure human pity for another soul, about to be fed into Nero's delusion machine. He's lovely, Sporus says, recovering. But divinity cannot be replicated, my lord. There is only one reborn empress. It's exactly what Nero wants to hear, which is why he immediately becomes suspicious. This is the problem with manufactured realities. They require constant maintenance, and everyone involved is getting tired. The courtiers are tired of pretending, Sporus is tired of performing, and even Nero seems exhausted by his own fiction, though he'd rather die than admit it. The cracks are becoming chasms. At a public ceremony, Sporus stumbles over Poppaea's favorite prayer, mixing up words he's recited perfectly 100 times before. During a theatrical performance, he laughs at the wrong moment, not Poppaea's tinkling laugh, but a deeper sound that seems to surprise everyone, including himself. Small failures, tiny rebellions. But in Nero's carefully constructed fantasy, they land like earthquakes. Perhaps, a physician suggests carefully, when consulted about Sporus's lapses, the divine transformation is still settling. These things take time. Nero stares at him, with eyes that have gone full emperor mad. Time. It's been 3 years. How much time does divinity require? The physician, wisely, does not point out that actual divinity typically requires being dead first. He prescribes more herbs, different treatments, anything to avoid saying what everyone knows, that you can't surgically create a ghost, no matter how sharp your scalpels or desperate your grief. The year 68 CE arrives like a hangover after a 3-day bender, and the Roman Empire is finally done pretending Nero's madness is sustainable. You're in the palace when the first reports arrive from Gaul, carried by exhausted messengers who look like they've been personally chased by the news they're delivering. Governor Gaius Julius Vindex has declared revolt, calling Nero a pitiful artist, and this is the part that makes everyone wince, a eunuch maker who plays with boys dressed as his dead wife. Nero receives this news while in the middle of a lyre lesson he's giving to Sporus, because apparently even civil war can't interrupt the emperor's commitment to musical education. Vindex, he says, not even looking up from the strings, that Gallic barbarian who couldn't tell a proper verse from a pig's grunt? Let him revolt. More time for true artists to flourish. But then more messengers arrive. Servius Sulpicius Galba in Hispania has joined the rebellion. Clodius Macer in Africa is considering it. The governors are falling like dominoes, and each one's declaration includes increasingly creative insults about Nero's marriage to Sporus, as if 3 years of suppressed disgust is finally finding its outlet in military rebellion. They're jealous. Nero insists that evening, pacing the throne room while Sporus sits in Papia's chair, watching this denial with the detached interest of someone watching their own execution being planned. They see our divine love, and it burns them. Mortal minds can't comprehend what we've achieved. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The revolt of Vindex in March 68 CE was initially more about taxes than Nero's personal behavior, but it quickly became a lightning rod for every grievance the empire had accumulated. Vindex himself was reportedly less concerned with Nero's artistic pretensions or sexual choices than with the crushing taxation needed to fund things like the Golden House and Greek tours. But once the rebellion started, every governor with ambition suddenly remembered how scandalized they were by imperial behavior. The Senate, those masters of reading the wind, start their delicate dance of shifting loyalties. You watch them in their sessions, speaking in code so elaborate it would make spy novelists weep. Perhaps the divine Augustus needs rest, one suggests, which translates to, how do we get rid of him without getting crucified? Another proposes, supporting the emperor in these trying times, which means let's wait to see who's winning before picking a side. Sporus, meanwhile, has developed an interesting new habit. He's started collecting small, valuable objects, jewels that can be sewn into clothing, gold coins that fit in hidden pockets, the kind of portable wealth that suggests someone planning for a sudden change in circumstances. Nero either doesn't notice or pretends not to, too busy composing what he calls his victory symphony to celebrate defeating rebels he hasn't actually fought yet. "My dove," Nero says one night, finding Sporus in the gardens where he's been spending more and more time. "You seem distant lately. Are you worried about these provincial upstarts?" Sporus looks at him with eyes that have seen too much to ever be young again. "I worry only for your divine safety, my lord." It's become his standard response to everything. Flat, automatic, like a prayer repeated so often it's lost all meaning. The quirky historical tidbit that really drives home how delusional Nero had become when he heard about Galba's rebellion. His first concern wasn't military strategy, but the fact that Galba had called his voice inadequate. He spent 3 days composing a rebuttal in verse form, planning to have it read to the troops, because nothing motivates soldiers like being forced to listen to their emperor's poetry about why his singing is actually transcendent. By April, even Rome itself is turning. The Praetorian Guard, who've been loyal as long as the money flowed, start making noises about delayed payments. Turns out that spending the treasury on Greek tours and castration surgeries doesn't leave much for bribing your personal army. Who could have predicted? "We'll tour the eastern provinces," Nero announces suddenly at dinner, gesturing wildly with a chicken leg. "They appreciate art there. We'll give concerts. Sporus and I, the revenues will fund 10 legions." The dinner guests exchange glances that clearly communicate he's completely lost it. One general actually starts openly weeping into his wine. Sporus just continues eating with mechanical precision, cutting his food into smaller and smaller pieces like he's trying to make the meal last forever because he knows what comes after dinner might be worse. The cracks in Nero's sanity become chasms as May arrives with news that Galba has been declared emperor by his troops. Nero's response is to order the construction of a new theater. "We'll perform the entire Trojan cycle," he declares. "I'll play Achilles, Hector, Helen, and Cassandra. Sporus will be my chorus. The people will see true art and remember why they love me." "Of course, Divine One," Sporus murmurs. But he's already started giving away his less portable possessions to favored slaves. One morning, a servant finds him teaching a young kitchen boy to read, using wax tablets filled with what look like survival instructions disguised as poetry lessons. The end comes faster than anyone expects. On June 8th, the Senate finally grows a collective spine and declares Nero a public enemy. The news reaches the palace at dawn, carried by the last loyal freedman, who immediately starts packing after delivering it. The rats aren't just leaving the ship, they're taking the lifeboats and the emergency supplies. "Impossible," Nero says, still in his night clothes, clutching the declaration like it might change if he stares at it hard enough. "I'm a god. Gods can't be enemies of the state. I am the state." But even gods need guards. And the Praetorians have mysteriously vanished during the night. The palace, usually bustling with hundreds of servants and courtiers, echoes with emptiness. Only a handful remain, the too loyal, the too slow, and Sporus, who sits at Poppaea's vanity, applying makeup with steady hands like this is any other morning. "We could flee to Egypt," Nero suggests wildly. The Egyptians understand divinity. They'll welcome us. We'll establish a new Rome on the Nile, a city of pure art where my lord. Sporus interrupts, and it's the first time in 3 years he's cut Nero off. His voice has dropped from its practiced feminine pitch to something in between, neither fully male nor fully female, but entirely exhausted. Perhaps we should consider more immediate concerns. The sound of marching feet in the distance makes those immediate concerns very clear. The Senate's soldiers are coming, and they're not bringing flowers. Historians still argue about why Sporus stayed when he could have fled. The romantic interpretation is Stockholm Syndrome. So complete, he couldn't imagine life without his captor. The pragmatic view suggests he knew that as Nero's wife, he'd be hunted down anyway. So why run? The cynical reading is that he wanted to watch Nero's final performance, to see the last act of the tragedy he'd been forced to co-star in. "My lyre," Nero cries out. "I need my lyre. I'll compose my death song. Future generations will weep at its beauty. Sporus, you'll sing the harmonies." But when he turns, Sporus is already walking away, still in Poppeia's dress, but moving with the stride of someone who's finally dropped a character they've been playing too long. He doesn't look back, and for the first time in 3 years, Nero is left without his audience of one. Nero calls after him, and you can't tell if he's calling for his dead wife or the living boy he tried to turn into her. "My dove, don't leave me. The gods don't abandon each other." The marching feet grow closer. A loyal freedman tugs at Nero's arm, trying to pull him toward the last exit, but the emperor stands frozen, staring at the empty doorway where his manufactured wife disappeared, finally understanding that all the surgeries and hormones and performances in the world can't make the dead live again or turn people into possessions. "What an artist dies in me," he whispers. But for once, there's nobody left to applaud. Nero's suicide happens off stage, as it were, in a freedman's villa, 4 miles from Rome, and you arrive just in time to see Sporus emerging from the chaos, like a very expensive refugee. He's still wearing one of Poppeia's dresses, the purple one with gold embroidery that cost more than a year's grain supply for a small town. But he's walking differently now, no longer gliding in that practiced feminine way, but moving with the urgent efficiency of someone who's finally allowed to hurry. What happens to the emperor's widow? A Praetorian guard asks his companion, as they catalog the palace's abandoned treasures. The question hangs in the air like incense at a funeral nobody wants to attend. The answer comes in the form of Emperor Galba, the 73-year-old governor, who's managed to outlive and outmaneuver Nero, mostly by being too boring to assassinate earlier. Galba takes one look at Sporus and sees not a person, but a problem that needs managing. "The boy comes with us," he declares with the enthusiasm of someone ordering wheelbarrow repairs. "Can't have Nero's, whatever he is, running loose. Bad for the new regime's image." So Sporus trades one captivity for another, though this one's more like being a museum piece than a wife. Galba parades him around as evidence of Nero's depravity. "Look what the tyrant did. Aren't you glad I saved Rome from such perversions?" It's deeply ironic that Sporus's mutilation, which was supposed to transform him into an object of love, has instead made him a political prop, to be displayed and discussed, but never quite seen as human. Here's your historical fact. Galba's reign lasted exactly 7 months, from June 68 to January 69 CE, making him the first in what historians call the Year of the Four Emperors. His main achievements were being cheap, cruel, and catastrophically bad at reading the room. He refused to pay the Praetorian Guard their promised donatives, which is like refusing to tip your armed bodyguards. Technically legal, but strategically suicidal. But then comes the plot twist. Nobody saw coming. Least of all, Sporus, Marcus Salvius Otho. Yes, that Otho. Poppeia's first husband, the one Nero sent to govern Lusitania to get him out of the way, stages a coup in January 69. And his first act after having Galba murdered in the Forum, he claims Sporus as his own. It's poetic justice. Otho announces to his confused court, "Nero stole my wife. Now I'll care for his widow." The pause before widow is audible. Everyone in the room trying to figure out the proper terminology for a surgically altered boy dressed as a dead empress who's technically the previous emperor's spouse. Roman law schools would be debating this for centuries, if they weren't all too busy being sacked by barbarians. The really twisted part, Otho, seems genuinely kind to Sporus, at least by the standards of people who treat other humans as collectibles. He doesn't force him to continue the Poppaea charade, allows him to dress more simply, even speaks to him occasionally, like he's a person rather than a walking political statement. For about 5 minutes, you can see something like hope flickering in Sporus's eyes. "Did you love her?" Sporus asks one night. Probably the first real question he's asked anyone in years. They're dining privately, which Otho prefers because public banquets remind him he's not very good at being emperor. Otho considers this while dissecting a roasted dormouse with unnecessary precision. "I thought I did, but Nero taught me something. Love and possession aren't the same thing, even if poets pretend otherwise." He looks at Sporus with something approaching empathy. "You survived him. That makes you stronger than any of us realized." But Otho's reign lasts only 95 days before another general, Vitellius, decides he'd like a turn at being emperor. The Battle of Bedriacum in April 69 is a catastrophic defeat for Otho's forces, and rather than face capture, he falls on his sword like a proper Roman, leaving behind a situation that makes everyone very uncomfortable. What do you do with the previous emperor's fabricated widow, who was briefly under the protection of the previous emperor, who just killed himself? Vitellius's solution showcases the kind of creative cruelty that makes you understand why the Roman Empire eventually collapsed under the weight of its own horrible ideas. He decides Sporus will make the perfect addition to his triumph celebrations, not as a trophy, but as entertainment. "You'll play yourself," Vitellius explains, with the kind of grin that makes sharks nervous. "Well, not yourself. You'll play Proserpina in a theatrical reenactment of the rape of the underworld queen. The crowd will love the authenticity." Your quirky historical tidbit. Roman triumph celebrations often included elaborate theatrical performances that blurred the line between entertainment and humiliation. Captured enemies were forced to play themselves in reenactments of their defeats, but forcing Sporus to play a rape victim in front of the Roman mob. That was innovative even by Roman standards of awful. Sporus receives this news with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that can happen to you. "And if I refuse?" he asks, though he already knows the answer. "Then you'll play a different role," Vitellius says cheerfully, "the kind that involves lions and doesn't require memorizing lines." It's June 69 CE, and Sporus stands in a room full of theatrical costumes, each one designed to emphasize his mutilation for the crowd's amusement. He fingers the fabric of Proserpina's dress, cheaper material than Poppaea's gowns, because Vitellius doesn't believe in wasting good silk on arena entertainment. Through the window, he can hear the crowd gathering in the amphitheater, their excitement building for the day's spectacles. The historical sources differ on exactly what happens next. Tacitus says Sporus killed himself rather than face this final humiliation. Cassius Dio suggests he took poison. The most detailed account claims he used a concealed blade, probably one of those jeweled hairpins he'd worn as Nero's empress, which would be poetically appropriate if poetry could be written in blood and irony. What we know for certain is that Sporus chose his own exit. After 3 years of being transformed, displayed, married, widowed, collected, and finally scheduled for public degradation, he performed his last act of autonomy at approximately age 21, though records are uncertain, because who bothers recording a slave boy's exact birthday? Sporus decided he'd played enough roles for other people's entertainment. The servant who finds him reports that he was wearing a simple tunic, not Poppaea's dresses or Proserpina's costume. For the first time in years, he died looking like himself. Whatever that meant, after everything that had been done to him, and everything he'd been forced to become. Historians still argue about Sporus's death, as they argue about his life. Was it courage or despair? A final act of defiance, or the inevitable conclusion of a tragedy that began with spilled honey cakes? The Roman historians, with their typical sensitivity, mostly treat it as a footnote to Nero's greater madness, the artifact destroying itself after its creator's death, as if Sporus was never more than an appendix to someone else's story. But in those last moments, choosing death over another performance, Sporus wrote his own ending. Not as Poppaea reborn, not as Nero's delusion, not as anyone's symbol or scandal or salvage, but as a human being who'd finally found the one transformation nobody could take away from him. In a world that had stolen his body, his identity, and his future, he kept the only thing truly his own, the right to refuse one more show. Vitellius, deprived of his entertainment, has to make do with regular gladiators and wild beasts. The crowd grumbles about missing the promised spectacle, but by December, Vitellius himself is dead, dragged through the streets by Vespasian's supporters, and Rome has yet another emperor. The wheel turns, the powerful fall, but Sporus has already stepped off the stage. In death, he achieves what he couldn't in life: autonomy, dignity, and finally, silence. No more performances, no more transformations, just the quiet of someone who's given their last unwilling show. As our strange and terrible journey comes to its close, you find yourself drifting back through the corridors of time, leaving behind the marble halls and golden palaces where one boy's transformation became the symbol of an empire's madness. The images begin to soften now, like memories dissolving in warm water. The sharp edges of swords become curves, the screams fade to whispers, and even the blood seems less red in the gentle dimness of approaching sleep. Perhaps somewhere in the multiverse of possibilities, there's a timeline where a young man named Sporus lived out his days peacefully, carrying honey cakes through palace halls without catching the eye of any grief-maddened emperor, where Poppaea died of old age, surrounded by grandchildren, and Nero channeled his artistic pretensions into bad poetry that harmed nothing but good taste, where transformation meant the natural changes of growing older, not the violent remaking of bodies to fit impossible fantasies. But history gave us this story instead, uncomfortable, tragic, and undeniably human in all its terrible complexity. As you settle deeper into your pillow, let the ancient world recede like tide pulling away from shore. The palaces crumble back to dust, the emperors return to their graves, and all those desperate performances finally, mercifully end. Tomorrow the sun will rise on your own world, your own choices, your own body that belongs to no one but yourself. And if you dream tonight, may your dreams be gentle ones of honey that's simply sweet, of clothes that fit the person you choose to be, and of transformations that come from within, born of your own desires and not another's grief. The past is past, written in stone and fading scrolls, but your story is still yours to write. Sleep well, dear listener. Morning always comes,